The winter fields of eastern France stretched in muted waves of white and grey, a landscape at once serene and merciless, its silence broken only by the distant rumble of artillery that pulsed like the heartbeat of a wounded world. In that vast and desperate quietude marched Private Elijah Warren, a young American infantryman whose presence in the war seemed almost accidental, as though life itself had stumbled while placing him on the map and left him standing on the edge of a conflict far larger than anything his hands or heart had been shaped to hold. He carried slung over his shoulder the object of endless mockery within his platoon, an old, battered, half-warped training rifle that supply officers had handed him by mistake and never bothered to replace. The men laughed at the sight of him, calling him museum boy, wooden soldier, rookie relic, all those small, sharp cruelties men invent when they need to forget their own trembling. Yet Elijah endured each comment with quiet eyes, not out of saintliness or timidity, but because in a war of steel and fire, he had found a strange comfort in the imperfect weapon that rested against his palm, like an outstretched hand from another life. The rifle was long, scarred, its wood faded by earlier wars or earlier weather, no one could say. Its barrel wasn't bent, but neither was it straight with the proud precision of the others. Its bolt stuck unless coaxed with a firm, patient motion. It lacked the crisp authority soldiers craved from their tools of death, yet it had something else, some subtle balance, some calmness in its weight that kept Elijah from resenting the joke. While the others smirked, he practiced in secret, lying prone in snowfields before dawn, breathing in the silence, letting the cold numb everything except the steady beat of concentration. He watched the way frost crystallized on distant fence posts and pretended they were watchtowers. He imagined the shifting shadows of tree branches as enemy helmets rising and falling with breath. He learned how the wind dragged across the valley and how long he needed to let it escort each bullet on its narrow path. And in those hours alone, he discovered that a rifle did not need to be perfect to obey the instincts of someone who listened closely enough. War pressed in from every direction. The German retreat had turned the countryside into a labyrinth of hidden nests and desperate ambushes. The enemy clung to their vantage points with the obsession of men who knew the war was slipping from their fingers. Among them were the SS snipers, ghosts of the tree line, skilled beyond cruelty, patient beyond fear. Their bullets had already taken 3 men from Elijah's company in as many days, leaving the survivors shaken and sleepless, whispering stories of invisible eyes watching from the branches. When Elijah volunteered to scout ahead, the platoon stared in disbelief. Some thought him brave, others foolish, but most believed they were sending a boy with a toy into a forest filled with hunters carved from stone. The lieutenant hesitated, yet something in Elijah's calm expression, an almost unsettling certainty, convinced him to nod. The forest swallowed him whole. Snow muffled every step, and the air carried a tension so sharp it felt like a blade pressing along the spine. Elijah moved as though returning to a familiar room, each breath measured, each pause deliberate, his senses stretched wide, encompassing the tremor of branches weighed down by frost, the soft whisper of wind curling through roots, the faintest glint of metal far ahead, where a broken stump rose like a frozen fist. He felt it then, that strange alignment between body, breath, rifle, and world, a moment where everything narrowed into a thin corridor of awareness so precise it seemed almost unreal. He lowered himself into the snow and waited, letting the cold seep into him until he became indistinguishable from the frozen land itself. The crack of a distant twig revealed the first sniper, moving with the arrogance of someone convinced no one could see him. Elijah saw not the man, but the pattern of his movement, the small swell of dark fabric against a pale branch, the angle of a rifle that sought another life to extinguish. Elijah's old training weapon felt alive in his hands, humming with the pulse of possibility. He exhaled slowly, the breath unspooling like thread, and when the shot left the barrel, it did so with the quiet certainty of something long overdue. The forest absorbed the sound, and the sniper fell back without drama, as if simply returning to the earth he had tried to dominate. Elijah did not smile, nor gasp, nor tremble. He simply watched the branches settle again, watched the quiet return, and felt the strange, heavy truth that the first of 10 had fallen. He slipped deeper into the forest, guided not by fury or pride, but by an unwavering duty, the kind that presses itself into a man's bones when he realizes he is the thin and accidental barrier between his comrades and the grave. The snow thickened, the sky dimmed, and Elijah walked forward, a lone figure with a mocked rifle and a resolve forged not of bravado, but of the quiet, unyielding strength that only those underestimated ever truly understand. In 3 days, his path would carve itself into the legend of his battalion. But here, at the beginning, he was only a boy with a burden no one believed he could carry. Before we continue, tell me if this first part feels right to you, or if you'd like any adjustments in tone, pacing, emotion, or detail. Also, as the story would say naturally, where in the world are you watching from? By dawn of the second day, the snow had begun to thaw in slow sighs, leaving streaks of brown earth beneath the white, as though the land itself were beginning to bleed through the winter's wound. The platoon woke to the sound of quiet footsteps and the hollow echo of a single shot that had travelled from somewhere deep within the woods hours earlier. When Elijah returned, his face was grey with exhaustion, but his eyes, those still, unflinching eyes, held something the others had never seen before, the strange calm of a man who had stepped past fear and found something colder on the other side. Slung over his shoulder was that same battered rifle, now speckled with melted snow and faint traces of mud. No words passed between him and the men at first. They only stared, waiting for him to confirm or deny what rumour already whispered. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and unshaken. "One down," he said simply. No pride, no story, just the truth, plain as frost. At first, they thought it luck, a fluke, but then, before the sun reached its full strength, another crack of distant thunder echoed. The lieutenant lifted his binocular, scanning the hills where German fire had harassed them for days, and saw movement, then stillness, a single shot. Another body falling backward into the snow like a broken marionette. The platoon froze in disbelief. "That's him," someone muttered. "It's Warren." The lieutenant said nothing. The forest had become Elijah's cathedral, and none of them dared enter it without permission. They waited for him to return, and when he did, the second confirmation was the same. No triumph, no gloating, only a faint nod, the kind of acknowledgement a man gives when his work is not yet finished. Word spread through the company. The boy with the training rifle, the one they had mocked for carrying a relic that couldn't even pass inspection, had now taken down 2 SS snipers in less than 24 hours. Veterans who had survived since Normandy began to glance his way with cautious respect. The laughter ceased, replaced by the uneasy silence that follows revelation. They began to ask questions they didn't dare speak aloud. What if his strange weapon, with its imperfect balance and weary stock, was more than just an accident? What if there was something sacred or cursed about it? But Elijah gave them no answer, because the truth had little to do with the rifle itself. The weapon was only an instrument. The music it played came from the rhythm of a soul that had found, within the chaos, a place where everything unnecessary fell away. As the second night approached, frost clung again to the trees, whispering secrets between the branches. Elijah did not sleep. He cleaned the rifle with slow, deliberate care, tracing each scratch as though it were a map of every mistake he had ever made and every life he now carried within him. Around him, the men drifted into uneasy rest, their dreams stitched together with gunfire and ghosts. He listened to their breathing, to the wind beyond the tent, to the pulse of the earth itself. Somewhere out there, more eyes watched, patient and cruel. The SS snipers were not just marksmen. They were predators, raised on discipline, trained to make their deaths invisible, their cruelty efficient. Elijah knew they would come searching for the one who had broken their unseen circle. He would not wait to be found. Before dawn, he moved again. The snow creaked beneath his boots like brittle glass. He followed the faint trail of cigarette ash and footprints barely visible along the ridge. The forest had grown intimate to him. He could sense the weight of eyes long before he saw the glint of a scope. When the third sniper revealed himself, hidden within the skeleton of a burned-out barn, his rifle aimed toward the distant road where Elijah's comrades would march by midday, Elijah did not hesitate. He exhaled, measured the silence between heartbeats, and fired. The sound was swallowed by the snow. Another figure fell. Another echo faded into memory. Back at camp, disbelief gave way to awe. By the third day, whispers turned to something close to reverence. Men began to follow Elijah's movements from afar, marking the times he left, the direction he took, the precise rhythm of his return. They no longer called him Museum Boy or Rookie Relic. They called him the Ghost with the Wooden Gun. And though he hated the nickname, he understood what it meant to them. In a world where hope was often nothing more than a rumor, he had become a symbol, proof that the underestimated could bend the shape of fate itself. That night, The lieutenant found him alone beside the fire, staring at the rifle laid across his knees. "Warren," he said quietly, "Command wants to know your secret." Elijah looked up, the firelight flickering in his tired eyes. "No secret, sir," he answered. "Just patience, just listening." He paused, fingers tightening. "They keep watching from the trees. I can feel them." The lieutenant studied him for a long moment before nodding. "Then keep listening, son, for all our sakes." And as Elijah turned his gaze back toward the darkness, the forest seemed to breathe with him. Somewhere beyond that horizon of frost and fear, more snipers waited. The storm was not yet over. The boy and his battered rifle had become something else entirely, a quiet storm of his own, invisible, inexorable, and gathering. If you've been drawn into Elijah's story so far, this is the perfect moment to subscribe and follow for the next chapter of his relentless hunt through the winter of war. The morning of the third day rose beneath a pale, sickly light that barely managed to break through the dense shroud of mist crawling over the valley. The forest had become a maze of vapor and silence, a place where even sound seemed afraid to move. Elijah Warren crouched among the frostbitten roots of an oak tree, his body stiff, his breath shallow and invisible in the fog. He had slept little, though exhaustion now pressed down on him like an added layer of snow. His fingers trembled, not from fear, but from cold and the dull ache of too much focus. The rifle, his strange, imperfect companion, rested across his lap, its metal damp with dew, its stock rough with dried mud. He had begun to think of it as something alive, a creature that had chosen him out of pity or destiny, its will intertwined with his in the quiet pact of survival. All around him, the echoes of death lingered like ghosts. The SS snipers, 10 in all, had spread through these woods to halt the American advance, each positioned with mathematical precision to ensure that no soldier crossed alive. But 3 had already fallen to Elijah's quiet defiance. The others, now wary, hunted him as much as he hunted. It was no longer war between armies. It was a duel among phantoms, a whispering game of patience, stillness, and intuition played on the razor's edge of time. Every hour stretched into eternity. Every sound, a snapping twig, the distant cough of an engine, might signal the moment between life and death. The first shot of that morning did not come from Elijah. It came from the ridge to the east, a single flash so faint it could have been mistaken for a trick of the fog. A bullet split the air inches from his face, embedding itself into the tree behind him with a thud that seemed to shake the ground. The bark splintered, slicing his cheek. He didn't flinch. He didn't move. The sniper who had fired expected panic, a scramble, some sign of weakness. Instead, Elijah remained still, his heartbeat a steady drum beneath the weight of instinct. He closed his eyes, listening. The forest, once indifferent, now spoke in murmurs. The wind curled around the trees with small sighs. Somewhere ahead, a crow cawed, a warning perhaps, and in that sound, he found direction. He shifted slowly, no more than the width of a breath, and sighted down his rifle. The mist blurred distance, transforming shapes into ghosts. But through that veil, he saw what others might miss, the faint shimmer of light reflecting off a scope. His hand steadied, his thumb brushing the rough metal bolt. The training rifle groaned softly as he slid the cartridge into place. The breath he released was long, patient, tender, as though apologizing to the world for what he must do. When the trigger broke, it was not with fury, but inevitability. The bullet cut through fog and silence alike. A moment later, something heavy drew. He did not smile. He only exhaled once more, lowering the rifle, and whispered a brief prayer for the fallen. His faith was not in God, but in the balance of things, that for every cruelty, there might be one act of grace, however small. By the time the sun began to melt through the fog, 2 more snipers had revealed themselves. They worked in pairs, a tactic meant to catch the hunter off guard. Elijah moved through the forest like smoke, his movements precise, deliberate, learned through suffering rather than training. The forest seemed to shift with him, the branches bending to conceal his steps, the snow muffling his passage. He found the 5th man near a creek, half hidden behind a boulder streaked with ice. The German was young, his face clean, his breath visible as he muttered something to himself, a name perhaps, or a prayer of his own. Elijah hesitated, lowering his aim for the first time. But hesitation, in war, is its own kind of mercy, and mercy is what gets men killed. A glint of sunlight flashed off the German's rifle as he turned. Elijah fired. The echo rolled down the valley like thunder. 5. The 6th came an hour later, perched in the remains of a windmill overlooking the road. This one was older, disciplined, his eyes scanning the horizon without rest. Elijah had to crawl on his belly through half-frozen mud to get within range. The cold had numbed his hands completely by the time he reached position. He took aim, counting the beats of his heart. He could feel the wind shift, the subtle pull of nature telling him the exact moment when the bullet's path would hold true. He fired. The man fell without a sound, his rifle tumbling beside him like a forgotten promise. 6. By the time Elijah returned to camp, the fog had lifted, revealing a sun the color of iron. His uniform was soaked, his hands bloodied, his face hollowed by fatigue. The men rose when they saw him approach. They didn't cheer. They didn't dare. Instead, they stood in quiet awe, as though something sacred, or haunted, had walked among them. The lieutenant stepped forward. 6? Elijah nodded. 4 left, he said. That night, around the dim glow of the campfire, he sat apart from the others. The laughter that usually drifted from the tents was gone, replaced by the low hum of whispered prayers. Some said Elijah could see through the mist. Others swore his rifle had a spirit in it, the soul of every fallen comrade guiding his aim. But he knew better. It wasn't ghosts or miracles that led his hands. It was grief. The quiet, enduring grief of a man who understood that each pull of the trigger chipped away not only at the enemy, but at whatever humanity he had left. As the embers dimmed, Elijah looked to the woods once more. 10 had been sent. 6 were gone. The last 4 waited in the shadows, patient as wolves. He closed his eyes and listened to the night breathe, feeling the weight of what still lay ahead, pressing against his chest like a second heartbeat. And so, the hunt continued. The 4th dawn came drenched in silence, the kind of silence that feels less like absence and more like the world holding its breath. The forest was glazed with ice, every branch coated in glass, and when the wind passed through, it sang a thin, mournful song. The men at camp stirred restlessly, their nerves frayed by too many nights of waiting. Every hour, the distant pop of gunfire echoed from unseen corners of the valley, and each time, they wondered if that sound marked Elijah Warren's death or another of his quiet victories. He had left before sunrise again, wordless as always, the rifle slung across his back like a relic pulled from another century. No one stopped him now. No one laughed. They simply watched the figure vanish into the trees, into that white labyrinth where men went to test whether their will was stronger than winter, fear, or fate itself. By then, his name had begun to travel beyond the company. Other units whispered of the lone marksman with the old wooden rifle who had turned the forest into a graveyard for the SS. The Germans spoke of him too, in low, wary tones, calling him Der Unsichtbare, the invisible one. They set traps, laid false trails, even used their own dead as bait. But Elijah had grown intimate with their patterns, their logic, their cruelty. He no longer hunted like a soldier. He moved like something older, like a force of nature reclaiming its balance. The snow had become his ally, the wind his messenger, the silence his cover. He did not stalk them for glory or revenge. He did it because it needed to be done, because his brothers in arms deserved to walk one more mile, breathe one more morning. As daylight bled slowly into the canopy, Elijah knelt near the remains of a farmhouse long since burned to ruin. Smoke-stained stones jutted from the snow like teeth. He found signs there, boot prints, cigarette butts, the faint indentation of a rifle stock against the frozen mud. The 7th sniper had been here recently. Elijah followed the trail west, moving with the same rhythm as the forest itself. 3 steps, pause, listen, 4 breaths, then melt into stillness again. Ahead, beyond a cluster of birches, the faint gleam of glass caught his eye. He froze, a scope. The enemy was waiting. He did not raise his rifle immediately. Instead, he studied the scene. The sniper had built a small nest of branches beneath a fallen beam, his camouflage near perfect except for a single mistake, a patch of snow displaced by careless movement. Elijah circled left, low and silent, until he had the angle. He felt no pulse of adrenaline, no surge of hatred, only the cold, the kind of cold that seeps beyond the skin, into the soul. He exhaled, and the world seemed to narrow to a single point. The shot came softly, the sound swallowed by the snow. When it was done, he approached, gaze steady. The man before him was no monster, just another soldier, young, pale, eyes wide open toward nothing. Elijah closed them gently before moving on. 7. By noon, the forest had changed again. The wind had shifted south, carrying the faint hum of engine, the promise of reinforcements. Yet Elijah paid no mind to the war beyond his small corner of it. He was already deep within another hunt, following a trail so faint it could have belonged to memory. The 8th sniper had chosen higher ground, a rocky outcrop overlooking the valley road. Elijah's approach was slow, methodical, his mind a map of every sound, every shift of air. When the shot came, it struck the rock near his shoulder, scattering shards that tore through his coat. He rolled, slid behind cover, heart hammering once, twice, then returning to calm. The German fired again, impatient. Elijah waited, and when the silence fell, when the enemy paused to check his aim, Elijah's rifle spoke once more, clean and final. 8. The wound on his shoulder burned, but he bound it tight and pressed on. The sun was already sinking, staining the sky with bruised gold. Snow began to fall again, slow and relentless, covering every trace of struggle. The 9th sniper would be the most dangerous, he knew. Not because of skill, but because desperation makes men unpredictable. Elijah found his sign at dusk, a single cartridge casing glinting beside a frozen stream. The tracks led uphill. He followed until the cold grew unbearable, then saw him, the German crouched in the branches of a pine, rifle trained toward the road below. Elijah could have taken the shot instantly, but something in the scene made him hesitate. The sniper was humming softly, a lullaby perhaps, barely audible beneath the wind, a melody from another life, one that did not belong to war. Elijah lowered his rifle for the briefest heartbeat, and that mercy almost killed him. The bullet came first, grazing his temple. He fell back, vision blurring, blood running warm down his cheek. The pain snapped him back into the present. He rolled to his side, lifted the rifle with both trembling hands, and fired. The song ended mid-note. The man fell, limbs tangled in the branches like marionette strings cut loose. 9. Elijah sat there for a long while, pressing a hand to his wound, the snow beneath him turning pink. The forest seemed to sigh in relief, or in mourning. Only one remained now, the 10th sniper, the one they called Der Falk, the Falcon, a legend among the SS, said to see through mist, through movement, through lies. Elijah would meet him at dawn, though he did not yet know it. When he finally staggered back to camp, the men ran to meet him, their voices tight with disbelief. 9? Someone whispered. He nodded once, exhaustion clouding his vision. The lieutenant clasped his shoulder, eyes wide. Just one left, he said. Elijah's answer was faint. Just one left, sir. Then it's done. That night, as snow fell heavy and unbroken, Elijah cleaned his rifle one last time. The wood was darkened by age and weather, but his hands moved across it with reverence. Around him, the others slept, unaware of the quiet war still unfolding between two men destined to find each before the light returned. He looked to the fire, then to the stars above the treetops, and whispered softly, "Tomorrow." The forest listened. The final morning rose beneath a bruised sky. The snow had stopped, but the air itself seemed to hang in suspension, waiting for something inevitable to unfold. The forest, once a maze of motion, whispers, and smoke, stood utterly still. Even the crows were silent, as though the very life of the world had paused to witness what was coming. Private Elijah Warren moved through that silence like a shadow made of breath and memory, his body weakened by blood loss, his mind sharpened into pure instinct. His old rifle hung across his chest, the wood worn smooth by his touch. 9 shots had found their mark. Only one remained, the 10th sniper, the Falcon. His name alone was enough to draw unease even among his own men. They said he could see movement at impossible distances, could smell fear before it broke the air. A master marksman, decorated and fanatical, whose kills were not counted but remembered. Elijah knew that to end this ghost, he would have to enter the mind of a man who no longer believed himself mortal. It was not enough to shoot faster or aim straighter. He would have to listen more deeply than ever before, to the forest, to the wind, to the pulse of everything that still dared to live. He found traces of him at the ridge, where the woods gave way to open plain. There, among the frozen stumps, a single cigarette butt still smoked faintly. The Falcon was close. Elijah knelt, pressing his hand into the snow. It was warm beneath the top layer, freshly disturbed. He adjusted his breathing, letting the rhythm of his pulse slow until it matched the faint stirring of the air around him. He knew he was being watched. The Falcon was already sighted in. He moved deliberately, crouched low, his every step measured against the heartbeat of silence. The terrain sloped up, the snow shallow enough to reveal patches of stone and earth. The higher he climbed, the colder the air became, thin and dry, biting at the lungs. He stopped beside a dead oak, scanning the horizon. Nothing, no sound, no glint, just emptiness so vast it could swallow a man whole. And yet, somewhere in that emptiness, the Falcon waited. Elijah pressed his cheek to the stock of his rifle and closed his eyes. He let go of thought, of fear, of the exhaustion that clung to his bones. What replaced it was stillness. Time itself seemed to fade. The world reduced to a quiet dialogue between two unseen souls. And then he heard it, a sound so faint it might have been imagined, the click of a bolt being drawn back, half a mile away, carried by the wind. He did not open his eyes. He smiled, just slightly, the ghost of understanding passing over his face. The shot came a heartbeat later, a clean, perfect sound, slicing through the morning. It struck the tree beside him, tearing bark inches from his head. He didn't move. The falcon expected him to. That was the test. Elijah remained still as the snow falling from the branches, his breath shallow, his heart quiet. Then, without haste, he slid sideways through the snow, low and silent, circling the line of fire. The falcon fired again, once, twice. Both missed. Through the fog rising from the valley, Elijah caught a glimpse of movement, a faint flicker of color against the rocks, the faintest twitch of cloth. He steadied his rifle. The scope on his weapon was old, scratched, barely functional, but he no longer needed it. He had learned to see with something beyond his eyes. He waited, motionless. Then he spoke aloud, not to taunt, but to bridge the strange intimacy of their duel. "I see you." The falcon froze, half turning toward the sound. That was enough. Elijah exhaled and pulled the trigger. The rifle bucked softly against his shoulder. For an instant, the sound seemed to echo forever, bouncing between the trees and hills before dissolving into nothing. The figure on the ridge staggered once, then fell forward, his rifle slipping from his grasp, tumbling down the slope until it came to rest at Elijah's feet. 10. He climbed the ridge slowly, step by step, each one heavier than the last. The falcon lay face down in the snow, his gloved hand still outstretched, reaching towards something unseen. Elijah knelt beside him, turning the body gently. The man was older than he had expected, his face lined but calm, eyes staring skyward, as though even in death he refused to look down. Around his neck hung a silver cross, dulled by frost. Elijah hesitated, then pressed the cross into the man's cold palm. "Rest," he murmured. "It's over." But even as he said it, he felt the lie in the words, because nothing was truly over. Not the war, not the killing, not the weight of what he had done. The 10th sniper was dead, yes, but the silence that followed did not bring peace. It brought awareness, a deep, painful understanding of how much of himself he had left behind in this frozen forest. When Elijah returned to camp, the men gathered around him as if witnessing the return of someone from another world. They looked at the rifle in his hands, at the quiet emptiness in his eyes, and none dared speak for a long while. Then the lieutenant stepped forward, removing his helmet, and said softly, "It's done." Elijah nodded. "It's done." The lieutenant's gaze fell to the rifle. "That old thing," he said, almost reverently. "Guess it wasn't so useless after all." Elijah looked down at it, the worn wood, the scarred barrel, the faint trace of smoke still rising from the muzzle. "No, sir," he said, voice low. "It wasn't the rifle." The men cheered softly, but Elijah heard none of it. He walked past them, toward the tree line, where the forest opened once more to the horizon. Snow began to fall again, slow and weightless, covering every mark of battle. He stood there a long time, the rifle cradled in his arms like something fragile, and watched the wind erase the footprints of both hunter and hunted alike. In that moment, he understood the cruel poetry of it all, how war takes boys, mocks them, breaks them, then turns them into legends before they can remember who they were, and how sometimes the greatest victories leave no celebration, only silence. Behind him, the camp prepared to move on. Ahead, the world stretched white and endless. Elijah exhaled once, the sound vanishing into the cold. The forest did not answer. The war moved on without him, as wars always do. Victories and defeats folded over one another until names blurred into numbers and maps turned into silence. By the time Elijah Warren left the front, spring had begun its slow thaw across Europe. The snow he had lived within for months melted into dark rivers that carried the memories of battle downstream. Mud, ash, fragments of rifles, the whispers of the dead. His platoon was reassigned east, but the lieutenant, seeing the hollow quiet behind Elijah's eyes, sent him home instead. "You've done enough, son," he'd said, voice low with something between pride and pity. Elijah had only nodded. Enough. The word echoed in his chest like a hollow shell. He boarded the transport with his rifle wrapped in cloth, refusing to surrender it to the armory. It sat beside him like a sleeping animal, the weight of it both comfort and curse. He stared through the train window as the countryside passed, a blur of ruins and ghost villages, farmhouses half burned, children waving at soldiers who could not look them in the eye. The sound of the wheels against the tracks was steady, almost soothing, but behind it ran the quiet rhythm of gunfire that no longer existed except in his memory. The farther the train carried him from the front, the louder the silence became. When he reached the coast, the ships waited like steel leviathans, swallowing men and spitting them back out on another shore. Elijah crossed the Atlantic in grey monotony, the sea endless and cold. He spent the voyage mostly alone, writing nothing, speaking little, sleeping only in fragments. Sometimes he would wake at dawn and step onto the deck, staring into the horizon as though expecting the forest to rise from the waves, those ghostly snipers still waiting among the branches of the sea. The ocean breeze smelled nothing like the air of war. It smelled of salt and distance, of the life he no longer recognized. When he finally reached home, America seemed smaller than he remembered. The town where he'd grown up lay quiet beneath a sky too blue to be trusted. Children played on the main street, chasing paper planes. Men leaned against fences, reading headlines about the Allied push and the nearing end of the war. No one noticed the soldier walking past them, his uniform faded, his expression unreadable. At the corner store, the clerk, a boy he once knew from school, looked up and grinned. "Warren, you made it back, huh?" Elijah nodded, forcing a smile. The boy asked him what it was like over, but before Elijah could answer, the words caught in his throat. How do you explain to someone untouched by war that silence can have a sound, that snow can smell like blood, that the faces of men you kill follow you even when your eyes are closed? He said only, "Cold." The boy laughed, assuming it was a joke. Home was a small farmhouse on the edge of a hill, the same one his father had built before the Depression. His mother met him at the door, her hands trembling as she reached to touch his face. She wept quietly, whispering prayers between broken breaths. He hugged her, though his body felt distant, as if belonging to someone else. At night, he lay in his old bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind outside. But it wasn't the wind he heard. It was the faint crack of distant rifle, the murmur of men's last words, the breath of the forest that still lived inside him. Days passed in stillness. He helped repair fences, fed the horses, tilled the earth that had waited patiently for his return. But peace did not come. Every sound, every movement seemed to carry the echo of something lost. When a door slammed, he flinched. When snow fell late that year, he froze at the sight of it, feeling the pull of that other world. The rifle remained in the corner of his room, wrapped in the same worn cloth. Sometimes he would unwrap it and run his hand along the wood, the smell of oil and steel rising like a memory. It was not pride he felt, nor comfort, only connection, like two survivors sharing a secret too heavy for words. One evening, as the sun sank into the fields, he carried the rifle outside. The air was warm, the sky streaked with gold. He walked to the edge of the property, to the old oak tree that had stood there since his childhood. There, beneath its roots, he began to dig. The soil was soft, the earth welcoming. He lowered the rifle gently into the hole, the same way a man might lay down a friend to rest. He covered it with dirt, patting it down until no sign of it remained. Then he stood there a long while, watching the last light of day fade into the horizon. He whispered, "It's done." But even now, part of him knew it never would be. That night, as he sat by the window, he could have sworn he heard the sound of snow falling on leaves, the faint whisper of the wind through a forest half a world away. It was not haunting, it was remembrance, the echo of everything he had survived and everything he had lost to survive it. The war would end soon, but inside Elijah Warren, it would never truly stop. Years passed. The world rebuilt itself the way the earth reclaims a battlefield, slowly, silently, burying what it cannot heal. Roads were repaired, homes painted, laughter returned to the towns that had once wept. New wars were born out of old ones, but for most, the memory of that winter faded into history, neat and distant. Only those who had walked through its whiteness carried its ghost. Elijah Warren grew older in the quiet countryside, his hair turning grey before its time, his shoulders still bearing the invisible weight of the forest that had never really let him go. He rarely spoke of the war. When asked, he would smile faintly and change the subject. He lived alone after his mother's passing, tending to the same soil that had once fed his boyhood. Each morning he rose before dawn, stepped outside, and watched the mist lift from the fields, waiting for something he could never name. The villagers came to know him as the silent veteran, a kind man but distant, as though his spirit lived half a step behind his body. Children would run past his fence, shouting greetings, and he would nod, perhaps smile, but his eyes were elsewhere, lost in the memory of snow that no longer fell here. In town, Stories began to circulate. They said he was the one who took down 10 snipers in 3 days. They said he did it with a broken rifle, a weapon meant for training, not killing. Some called it a legend, others a lie, but all agreed on one thing. The man himself never denied it, nor did he ever confirm it. He simply listened, as if the stories belonged to someone else entirely. Sometimes, late at night, he would walk to the edge of the property, to the old oak where the rifle lay buried. The earth there had grown wild with moss, roots curling like veins across the soil. He would sit beneath the tree, resting his back against its trunk, and close his eyes. The forest would return to him then, the smell of pine, the breath of frost, the rhythm of his heartbeat aligning once more with the silence of that faraway war. He could almost hear them, the whispers of the men he had fought and the ones he had lost, carried on the wind like fragments of song. When the letter arrived decades later, from a historian, from a world that had forgotten the names but not the myths, it asked permission to interview him for a book on extraordinary acts of valor. Elijah read it carefully, then folded it and set it aside. That night, he dreamed of the forest again, but this time, the snow was warm. He saw himself as a boy, lying prone in the field with that old rifle in his hands, the frost biting his fingers. The laughter of his comrades drifted somewhere behind him. He took aim, but not at an enemy. He aimed at the horizon itself, at the place where war ended and everything after began. When he woke, tears had frozen on his cheeks. He never replied to the letter. Instead, he left it on the kitchen table beside a cup of cold coffee and went outside to watch the sunrise. The lights spilled over the hills in gold and red, the air trembling with birdsong. He stood there a long while, his breath steady, his hands loose at his sides. For the first time in years, he did not feel the cold. When he died, quietly, in his sleep, the townspeople buried him beneath the oak. No medals, no uniforms, no speeches, just the man and the soil. Years later, when the tree's roots deepened and the earth shifted, a farmhand found the edge of the rifle's stock protruding from the dirt. The wood darkened, but unbroken. They cleaned it, placed it beside his grave, and carved a simple inscription on the stone. He listened, and that was all. For in the end, that was what Elijah Warren had done better than anyone. He listened to the world, to the silence, to the voice within that told him when to act and when to stop. He had lived and fought not to prove himself, but to protect others from the sound of war's endless echo. His weapon, once mocked, had outlasted the laughter, the killing, and even the need for stories. It stood as a reminder that sometimes the quietest souls carry the heaviest burden, and that true strength speaks not in fury, but in stillness. The wind still moves through that oak tree on late autumn days, whispering through the leaves with the soft cadence of a man's breath. Some say if you listen closely and you can hear the faint click of a bolt sliding home, the sound of a rifle exhaling one last time before the snow begins to fall again. And somewhere, beyond the horizon of memory, the forest listens back. If Elijah Warren's story moved you, honor his silence with a moment of your own. Then, like his rifle's final echo, let it travel, like, share, and subscribe, so his quiet courage is never forgotten.